last decade, we've become the third largest tech economy in the world after the US and China.
Relish the prospect of going toe-to-toe with this government on saying who can make this transition work economically for the British people.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome on a very grey and wet December day. Thank you all so much for coming. My name is Kate Day. I'm Politico Europe's Deputy Editor-in-Chief, and I run the team here in London. I'm particularly excited to welcome you this afternoon for this event. This is something that when the team asked me if the newsroom might be interested in doing something on housing, we leapt at the chance, honestly. It feels to me like one of those issues that's a sort of submarine of British politics. We write about it every so often. We bump into it in all sorts of different ways in connection with different policy issues, but it doesn't always lead the headlines, and therefore it's great to have a bit of time and space this afternoon to really think about housing and talk about it. I'm sure there'll be some fantastic discussions. Thank you too to Airbnb, our sponsors today, who made this possible. I'm going to hand over in a minute to my colleague, one of our London Playbook authors, who I'm sure you all know well, Dan Bloom. But first, a couple of housekeeping points from me. We love questions. We love you all to join in. I saw there were some questions left even before we got started today, so extra points for those of you who logged on and did that. We use a tool called Slido. For those of you in the room, you can scan QR codes that will appear on the screen, like magic. And if you're watching along online, there are instructions on the website for how to leave questions. So we'll weave those into the debate, and please do post some. You can also join on Twitter, X, as we're now calling it, I always forget, using the hashtag UK Housing Challenge. So please join the debate, and over to Dan. Thank you very much.
Hello, thanks very much for coming. I am Dan Bloom. I'm the Deputy Editor of Politico's London Playbook, along with Eleni, my colleague, who you'll meet later. And Rosa, the editor, is here as well, interviewing the Housing Minister, Lee Rowley, later. And it's one of those rare occasions where you will see all three of us in the same room in daylight, which is not very common for our working hours. So we can appreciate it. So the event today, is the mic working? I think so. Is about the housing crisis and the landscape, and the event that we have now is about short-term lets and what the long-term solution is. So the background to this will be pretty obvious to most of you here. We've seen a big rise in short-term lets over the last few years, whether you call that COVID as a cause or just the Great British Staycation or a bit of something else. And that comes with some great benefits. You have yurts, caravans, and some interesting accommodation down the bottom of people's gardens. But you also have the problem that some people raise of houses that would otherwise be used for full tenants, long-term tenants, that are being converted sort of permanently or for a few years into short-term lets. And some of the issues that we have with coastal communities, represented by two of my panelists here, that we will come on to. So I will repeat the reminder from Kate about using Slido to submit your questions. We'll take as many as we can. I'll go for about the first half, and then we'll take questions from you for the second. And I'd encourage my panelists to jump in. You can give short, snappy answers if you want. You can elaborate if you want. And if you want to kind of cut it on each other, just sort of gesture to me, and we will go from there. So I'll introduce them right to left as you're looking at them. This is Andy Fenner, the Chief Executive of the Short-Term Accommodation Association, which is the voice for short-term let providers. Jane Kirkham, who's the Labour Group Leader on Cornwall Council, is that right? And the Labour candidate for Truro and Falmouth. I had to get the names the right way around. Yes. And Kevin Foster, who's a former minister in the Home Office, the Wales Office, the Transport Department, although not one of the 15 housing ministers that we've had since.
Not had my turn yet.
But we'll get onto that later. So I'm going to start with an easy question, or maybe not so easy. Have you ever used Airbnb or other providers are available? And what, if you have, what was the nicest, sort of the weirdest, wonderfulest, or just very pleasant short-term stay that you've had in the UK somewhere? I'll start with you, Andy, because you represent the sector.
Have I used Airbnb? You would be surprised to find out that yes, I have.
Oh, good. Yeah.
I use Airbnb all the time. My favourite one, there are hundreds, and I think that's one of the, and they're all different, they're all individual, and I think that's one of the beauties of the industry, that they're not uniform out of a box like a hotel room. They're all, or mostly owned by individuals, and they have individual character, and they're all unique. My favourite one, possibly staying in, I think it's called the UK's only desert on the south coast, Dungeness, in a converted, I think it was an air raid warden's thing, and we were looking out over the sea, and it was beautiful. And without facility like Airbnb, we would never have been able to have done that.
Excellent. Dungeness is actually my old patch on the local paper. I was going to mention my nicest one was when we went on the playbook tour this summer, going around the country to some marginal seats. I had a stopover in the Forest of Dean over the weekend and stayed in, it was called the Bike Shed, and I thought it can't actually be a bike shed, but it was this very nice lady's bike shed at the bottom of her garden, which she had sort of put a single bed in and a nice space heater. And I thought, this is a little bit rough, but when I looked out, there were bees and vines, and you could only see the forest because it was around the back of her house. But how about you, Jane?
I suppose I would say when you asked that, it made me think back to when I was younger, because that's how my family used to go on holiday back in the 70s and early 80s. So we went and stayed in houses, self-catering, places like Bournemouth, South Wales, Cornwall, of course, beautiful, Devon. And so I spent most of my childhood really going on holiday in places like that. So that takes me right back there really into the coast around the UK.
Okay. And Kevin?
Probably for me, like Jane, I think back to family holidays back in the 1980s, going to stay in a place like Kidwelly at the holiday park in the big caravan park. There, I must say I've never used Airbnb personally. Normally stay in hotels, guest houses. Of course, there's a huge variety of them as well. Many different types and many different from family owned right the way through to the big chains as well. So probably one of my most memorable stays was probably one of the first trips away myself and Hazel, my now wife, had, was when we went up to Edinburgh and stayed there in a place that overlooked, you could see the castle, and then went off to see the pandas.
Oh, very nice. So that's the easy question. The slightly harder question is, I want each of you to tell me what you've seen in your various patches, so 2 rural areas and in the industry more generally, from the rise that we've had over the last few years of short-term lets. Kind of give me some examples of how it's changed things in the last few years. I think I'll start with you, Jane, because you've been quite outspoken on it.
Yeah, I have, and that's because I live in Cornwall. I represent Cornwall, which is a beautiful place, and tourism is obviously a big industry there and has been for a very long time. But there is a balance, and I think in the last few years the balance has tipped to the point where it's become very, very difficult. So we have 10,000 second homes, I think 12,000 now in Cornwall, and we have about 14,000 now short-term lets, and we have about 26,000 people on our housing waiting list. So you can see that that's become a real issue, and I think what's happened recently is some of those houses, as you were saying earlier, that weren't initially supposed to be second homes, maybe some of those ex-council houses that have been sold off, or houses that were always residential private lettings, have now been sold, or people have been given Section 21 notices, and they've become short-term lets, and we've got real issues in Cornwall now. We've got our emergency and temporary housing accommodation list has shot up. We've got 857 households on that at last count. That's costing the council £40,000 a day in emergency and temporary accommodation. They're having to put shipping containers in council car parks. We're using Premier Inns. And it is true that a lot of those people have been evicted due to the houses being turned into short-term lets or being sold for that purpose. So it has become a real problem now. And I think the change that I've noticed particularly is when I became a councillor about 6 or 7 years ago now, the people who were in emergency and temporary accommodation were quite different to now. So the first problem I had really with this was when some people were evicted from their kind of short-term, from their long-term lets in flats above a shop, and they then became student accommodation. But they were all kind of single men, and we had to find accommodation for them, and that was very difficult. But now what we're finding is it's families, and families with children. And I think way over half of the people in emergency and temporary accommodation now in Cornwall have young children, and they're being taken miles and miles away from where their schools are, where their support networks are, into emergency accommodation, and often are finding it almost impossible to get back. So it's causing huge issues in Cornwall. The balance has tipped too far, and we need to right it.
Kevin, you also represent a coastal community in Torbay. Are you seeing the same issues here of people living in shipping containers, Section 21 notices, that kind of thing? Are they very widespread? And do you think that it's caused by short-term lets, or do you think there's something else going on?
Yeah, I think what I'd say is, in starting, the concept of, let's say, a platform like Airbnb, when it first started up, actually also gave some options for longer-term holiday accommodation, i.e. buildings that had been built as holiday cottages specifically, and some operators then provided their service or advertised their accommodation via it. I think what's happened over the last few years is it has grown quite significantly. It has grown in areas that were never really meant to be holiday accommodation. I've had, like Jane, examples of families being given an S21 by their landlord with a specific purpose of converting it into a short-term holiday let. And of course that then creates an irony that we're sometimes getting pressure to look at converting the core tourism area into residential, whilst meanwhile a residential street nearby starts to become more like a holiday park, with some of the issues that can then bring for the remaining residents. One of the things I highlighted in the debate I did earlier this year is that some of the issues that can be created by dropping off a short-term holiday let in the middle of a street can be similar to what we might see with a HIMO being dropped off in the middle of a street, given the very high turnover and some of the, obviously, sort of things people like to do when they're on holiday that might not necessarily go down particularly well with neighbours in a residential street. So we have seen a growth in it. Yes, at the start, there's a balance to be struck. An element of it provides a different type of choice and can bring on some properties that wouldn't fit into the traditional guest house or holiday park or hotel category that can legitimately be used for this purpose. But I think it's where it's gone too far is when we started to see literally residential accommodation. Also, and particularly in terms of giving councillors, we talk about housing, we've been on some of the podcasts before talking about things like encouraging councils to have some more confidence in giving planning permission for housing. If you can't be confident that giving planning permission in a coastal, and I say we're urban rather than rural Torbay, that's actually going to end up as mostly family accommodation, if you think it might actually, a lot of it, chunk of it, flip into a short-term holiday lets, that's not going to give you confidence to make that decision.
And Andy, tell me a bit about, feel free to come back to those points that are raised there, but also tell me about what it's been like for the association over the last few years. Have you kind of had an influx of members? How have people who provide holiday lets kind of been dealing with what is presumably demand going up as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing to bear in mind with that, yes, we have more members. This is a demand-driven scenario. Tourism is a dynamic, changing industry. One of my first jobs many years ago was working in tourism. I lived in a rural area. There were no other jobs, which is very common to most of our rural areas now. There is nothing else to do. I worked in tourism. I worked in the local hotel, which was owned, makes me sound very old, but it was owned by Trust House Forte, if anybody's old enough to remember them. That hotel is now boarded up and closed. Closed down about 7 months ago. And what is happening in the area is there are more Airbnb units, and that is because people want something different. We look at the last 2 weeks, various jobs have been lost in the tourism industry because Haven Holidays have just closed 2 of their holiday parks. The demand is changing, and we have to look at how we're using the built environment and what are we doing from. So that hotel could be converted into flats. We can't legislate to make people go on holiday in places where they don't want to go, because they will simply go abroad, they will go overseas, they will take that income somewhere else. But I do agree completely with what Jane and Kevin have said, that we need to find a balance. We do need to find a balance. We're not in the business of going around upsetting anybody. Why would we want to do that? We are in the tourism industry. We need to, what we want to do as an industry is bring in a registration scheme. And we have been campaigning for this for years, that we don't understand. We're talking about our industry, but the government has never put the money into it, never helped to bring in a registration scheme. We've asked for it, and Airbnb have asked for it. That registration scheme needs to cover the whole of tourism. There is no point singling out just holiday lets. We need to look at that changing dynamic that Kevin's talking about, guest houses and B&Bs. We need to look at where there are more holiday lets, are there less B&Bs? If we just look at one element, it doesn't work. And it needs to be across the whole of the country. Now, we met with the Tourism APPG about 3 weeks ago, and again campaigned for this. And we've now been told that the government is not going to introduce a national scheme, it's going to introduce a local selective scheme.
Of registration?
Of registration. Now, we can't do that. We have to have a proper national picture. Our members are not trying to get this for nothing. We know there's going to be a cost. They're quite happy for there to be a cost. And we want this to be brought in with regulation which covers the whole of England. We also deal with what's happened in Scotland, and we look at the absolute mess that has been created in Scotland by local schemes and by local policies. And it just does not work. It has decimated our industry. It's caused massive issues across the whole of tourism. And it's being used as an example of something we need to avoid. We cannot simply repeat that mistake.
So just to say, Scotland, and I may be fudging my facts here, I believe there's a licensing scheme, whereas what England is looking at is registration. It's still out, which is sort of a level below, if you like,
it is.
In terms of strenuousness. I guess I would ask the other two panelists, and you, Andy, do you think that the light touch system that they're talking about in England, albeit it's too light touch for Andy, is what you're hearing, is the right system, or do we need to go for full-on licensing like in Scotland and do more?
I think for me, the line I've gone down is the start, and certainly my local tourism industry is actually going down. Registration, partly the start of that is because we actually need to know where all the properties are and get a clear handle on the numbers. In terms of hotels, guest houses, and other types of holiday accommodation, we usually know where they are via the business rate system. That's the difference with this, is that there are properties which may be out short-term lets, which aren't registered, aren't taking part in that. And that also has some issues around things like fire safety regulations and other areas. We had a particularly notorious example in Torbay where a very large property was converted to a short-term let, very large numbers could stay there. And whilst the fire service was involved, it jarred up against the current regulations. So I think and I have some sympathy, it needs to be a clear and consistent system for registration, that it wouldn't make a huge amount of sense for Torbay to have a completely different registration system to South Hams, which is right next door. I think where there is, though, local policy is, I think it's more if we get into the planning side of things, where inevitably the type of considerations a coastal authority like Torbay will have around things like what percentage of holiday properties should be in a particular street would be a very different consideration, for sake of argument, one of the larger metropolitan councils in the West Midlands, and it wouldn't make sense to have the same sort of policy planning-wise in Paignton as perhaps where I used to be in Coventry, given the different dynamics that there are in the tourism market. But again, that would still, I accept the point, need to be based on some sort of national structure around use classes that is relatively predictable, because people, you know, do have a right to know whether, and in a clear and simple way, whether what they're doing requires planning permission or doesn't. But that's the other element to this that I do think does need to be done, is to change the planning rules.
Jane, is what the government's suggesting two things, isn't it? Registration and planning, and we don't know quite what either of them are going to look like yet.
No.
Do you think it's the right road?
I think it's been a very long time, because we've been talking about this down in Cornwall for about 9 or 10 years, if not longer now. And we've been waiting. We're still at the stage we're in consultations. So it feels like it's been a very long time, and the horse has bolted in a lot of cases. So it's very frustrating that we've had to wait this long. The Labour Party are promising a licensing system. Wales has done something similar, along with taxing, double taxing, treble taxing second homes, and looking at those planning use classes as well. So that licensing scheme isn't yet set in stone. But it's very important, I think, that we have some sort of licensing registration scheme, that we know where these properties are, and also that they're safe, because at the moment, those are the only ones that aren't regulated. Private rentals are, B&Bs are, hotels are, fire safety, that kind of thing, but these aren't. So that must be a consideration as well, that we know that where people are staying is safe as well. So that is obviously something to consider. The LGA have looked at a kind of a local government administered scheme, and they are suggesting that. They've replied to the consultation. So there are all these things out there. But to be honest, we're getting to the stage now where it's been too long, and it's too late. It's getting too late for Cornwall. And the devolved, we were talking about Scotland and Wales, the devolved administrations have been able to do something about this. So maybe the idea of devolution and people doing things or looking at slightly different rules in different areas might be an idea. And of course, devolution is something that the Labour Party have committed to within the first 100 days as well.
Well, we're about to actually do, hopefully, a devolution deal for Devon very, very soon. Obviously, there's already one potentially for Cornwall as well.
But not for housing.
Not for housing, but whether it's something beyond. But I would agree with the thrust that we actually, and also for the industry as well, there needs to be some certainty, because I think the consultation went out earlier this year. It's obvious there's some change coming. I don't think, regardless of which party wins the next general election, neither's standing on a platform of doing nothing on this. And ditto, we can't see the minor parties. Their views are clearly quite well there. But it is something we now need to make a decision and move on with, because I think also having some certainty for the industry in terms of their planning as well. You know, is it a licensing scheme? Is it registration? If it's planning usage, what's the flexibility for local decision making? And I can see, for example, Torbay and Cornwall would be local authorities very likely to take up the powers immediately. I can imagine for a number of other councils around the country, this would be, well, this isn't really an issue for us, and why go through the process of having to identify those properties with grandfather rights and everything else. But so again, but based on a national framework that's very clear of what is the category and how it works, to again also partly ensure that councils don't then find themselves dealing with numerous JRs about every single decision they make in this area.
Kevin, you're no longer part of the government. When you look as a backbench MP for a coastal community at what the government's doing, do you think it's enough?
Well, to be fair, I'm representing an area where the government's offering up just over £100 million worth of regeneration funding, and there's quite a lot of support coming in, and we can see around business rates and other issues. And we also have to look at the fact that, just talking around short-term lets isn't a magic bullet for the housing issues that there are in our communities. There's clearly a need to build more housing and to also have the type of housing that serves families. But in terms of this one, I think the consultation was welcome, but I do think we now need to make decisions and move on. It probably wasn't helpful that Rachel has moved on in that context, but, the issue's there, and we now need to actually make some decisions. I think there's, to be fair, even coming up to an election, there's a broad consensus around the basics of what we would wish to do in this area, which would allow progress to be made.
Do you think that the churn of, as we mentioned at the beginning, there have been 15 housing ministers since 2010, and I think I've got the number in front of me and I've somehow lost it, but it was something like 6 or 9 in the New Labour years as well. So sorry if I've got that wrong. Do you think that this is part of the problem?
Look, I was one of the longest serving immigration ministers in the last few years, which is a similarly complex and difficult area with lots of different interest groups and some very complex area of legislation. And it was helpful to be there for nearly 3 years in terms of that context. I don't think it's been helpful, the churn that we've had under either a set administration in what is a deeply complex area and an area where it is very litigious as well. The decisions you take make a massive difference in terms of individuals. So no, it's not been helpful. That's the churn we've had. And I hope, but Lee isn't a newcomer, and I hope now Lee gets a good long period over the next few years to take forward a good policy agenda.
Jane, it looks like you want to come in there. To say anything?
No, I was just going to say that 16 housing ministers obviously is too many. It is a complex area. There are a lot of wider issues about housing that you'll probably be talking about later, to be honest, to do with planning and the Affordable Homes Programme and how housing is built and how we can build some of that social and affordable housing. So to have consistency, certainty is so important in this area, and it's just what we haven't had.
Sure. Keep your questions coming in via Slido, because I'll go to some of those in a minute. But Andy, I'm sure you will choose your words terribly carefully when I ask you this, but you're here with the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, and there's an election next year. Do what either of them are saying appeal to you more? Do you think either of them have got the answer? Would you like both of them to be doing something different?
We have, as an association, as an industry, we've obviously reached out to all three political parties in the UK. We've had good and bad experiences talking to all sides. I mean, I think at the moment, I would agree with both Jane and Kevin. One of the issues that we've had is engaging with housing ministers and them then changing, and the same with tourism ministers and changing. And I think it's a priority issue. I mean, as Jane has said, from a government point of view, that for us as mere voters, the two most important things in our lives are our house and our job. Whereas the government does not prioritise, with the greatest of respect to the housing minister, it is not one of the top jobs in government. But it concerns one of the areas that is the top priority for everybody in this room. We all need somewhere to live. And all I hope is that whoever wins the next election prioritises housing and prioritises tourism, as tourism is one of the great drivers of the UK economy. We as a tourism industry just got through COVID. We had one of the worst experiences of any industry in COVID. The eat out, help out, if we can even use the word help in that sentence anymore, did not do anything for us as an industry. Our sector is mostly very small operators. Most people who have an Airbnb, to use it as a generic name, they own one property. It's normally an inherited house or an investment property. We have spent the last 20 years, perhaps longer, since Right to Buy came in, telling people, invest in property. You can't turn on daytime TV without seeing Homes Under the Hammer or buy this or do that. We've told people to go and invest in properties, and that this is what you should do to make your pension, and this is what you what you should do with your money. Now we've told people to do that, the government is now turning around and saying that actually, by making money from that property, which is what we've always told you to do, you're doing the wrong thing. And that's something that we've got to change, and we can only change that by recognising the part that our industry plays in the modern face of UK tourism. We would argue that the reason there are no houses or not enough houses for people to live in areas like where I grew up, the village that I grew up in, just down the road, Jane and I actually went to the same school, it's not very far down the road. The village I grew up in 40 years ago has not had a new house built in it for 40 years. There is nothing. I can't afford to live there. I couldn't afford to live there when I was 20. I can't afford to live there now. And that has nothing to do with Airbnb. The reason is we're not building enough houses. You look at the statistics for Cornwall and you look at the statistics for Devon. Devon has just over 20,000 houses in its development plan and that have been given planning permission that have not been built. Cornwall has about 18,000 properties that have not been built. The government needs to stop developers land banking and waiting for the property prices to go up and build the houses that we need to live in. We do not have, the government abandoned its own house building targets. We have to put those back and we have to start building houses. Now, I was at an event with Jane, and I'm not going to name the other MPs because they're not here to defend themselves, earlier in the year in Falmouth, where when we raised this with these 3 MPs, that we need to build these houses, we were told we can't build those houses because if we do, it will put too much strain on local services. Whereas the argument that we get is we haven't got, there aren't enough people living there, and that puts strain on local services. So we can't have this both ways. And we would argue that all we have to do is simply build the houses that people need to live in, rather than trying to affect one of the few successful parts of the UK tourism industry.
Jane?
There are so many points there, aren't there? There are things like land value and the fact that land is sold on hope value at the moment, so it's worth more when it's built on, so it's sold for more, so developers then struggle to build, and then they say it's not viable to put those affordable houses on there because of their costs. So we have to look at planning and all those kind of things, and that's something that we have been talking about. I just want to go back to COVID a little bit as well, because there is this other issue, isn't there, of second homes and short-term lets. £170 million was paid out to owners of short-term lets in Cornwall over COVID in business grants. 100 million of that went out of Cornwall, and those were properties that were registered as businesses because they were letting out or they were available to let for a certain period of the year. And they may simply have been second homes. That's a huge loophole, and that's an awful lot of money. So there are real issues in the sector when you look at that kind of thing, and with that loophole that really has to be closed, as well as the fact that, yes, of course, I mean, as I said earlier, we have, if you add them together, the same number of short-term lets and second homes, and those are just the ones we know about in Cornwall, as there are people on the housing list. Now, sure, some of those wouldn't be appropriate for families, but some of those are houses that families have been thrown out of. So you can readjust that balance, but you have to build as well. But there are all these other issues, talking about local plans, hope value, and the way we build, and construction as well. We don't have the construction companies in the far southwest in Cornwall anymore. So it's been really difficult to get those houses built. And there are all the difficult things about if you build fewer than 10, you don't have to build any social or affordable anyway. So all those things are things we need to look at, as well as at the industry and regulating the industry and how it's taxed.
I'll come in with a couple of Slido questions. So we've got James Ingram from the St Martin in the Fields charity, just down the road, who says, what improved role could landlords and providers of short-term lets play in helping people who are experiencing homelessness, including refugees? So I assume, I don't want to overinterpret the question, but we're perhaps talking about using homes that would otherwise be used as Airbnbs to kind of help alleviate that particular problem in the Home Office, which is why I'll go to you first, Kevin, as a former minister.
Yeah, I think in terms of housing schemes, again, it depends what we're talking about. If we're talking about full resettlement schemes, so for example, the Afghan resettlement, a short-term let flagrantly isn't going to be very useful for that one, because you need it to be a permanent home, particularly for the families we were bringing out of Afghanistan. You could possibly use them, but I think in terms of the properties concerned, realistically, you do use it via the dispersed accommodation route, because actually a lot of homes that are being set up for a short-term holiday let are probably not going to be overly suitable in terms of then potentially placing 2 or 3 people who may not necessarily know each other, but are suitable to share a property in terms of a shared occupation, which is a lot of what the dispersed accommodation. That said, again, it comes back to the issue of, what in certain areas, and, a lot of my boundary is the sea. So, of course, that means in some parts of the area, you can't actually build in one direction, you can only build inland. And therefore, what do we use some of those properties for? So an area like Roundham, which is very much on the coast, has always had a mixture of, retirement, tourism, and permanent homes for accommodation. And it's about, in many ways, those being, protecting that usage, and part of that would also then be other elements of rental that you do as well.
Jane?
Yeah, I was just thinking back to when I first became a councillor, and I live in Falmouth, so I live on the seafront, and I'd just been dealing with people who'd been made homeless, so we did the national homeless count not very long ago as well. So you're going out and you're finding people sleeping on the seafront, and then you're walking down the seafront, you're seeing all these empty windows with no lights in them in the winter because no one's living in them, and it is intensely frustrating. So of course people are going to think, well, why aren't we using these properties? Why are these properties sitting empty?
And do you want to come in, Kevin? Or
Sure, yeah. I mean, our industry stepped in during COVID and helped with the NHS Homes scheme, which was an industry-wide development to provide houses for key workers. But I don't think that providing, this is not an area, using tourism facilities and hotels, etc., to house people is not a solution. What we need to go...
Happening.
It is happening, but what we need to do is actually
expense.
go back to building the houses that people need to live in. The government needs to reinstate its housing targets and build houses. And until they actually do that, and we will never sort this issue. And why the government abandoned its own house building targets, you would have to ask them.
We have this in Cornwall, of course. You have people who are homeless being put in hotels in the winter, and then they get to the summer, and this happened in huge numbers in the G7, and they were all kicked out over a weekend because they needed those hotel rooms for the summer months or for the people coming down for the G7.
But also a hotel isn't
It's not the right place for people to be.
I can think of one or two examples in Torbay where what was sort of guest house stroke hotel accommodation is sort of being converted, if I can put it that way, into residential accommodation. It usually means it's poor quality, it regularly has housing enforcement issues, and of course the rooms that were designed for someone to spend 2 or 3 weeks in end up being a home when they, you know, the most basic of cooking facilities and stuff visibly can't really be provided, just produces a place that's likely to be a problem for the local council, likely to be poor quality for the individual staying there, and inevitably it can also attract some of the problems and issues because most people don't want to rent that type of place. So the type of trade that ends up there can be, again, be a magnet for problems. If we're going to convert, it does need to be converted properly, and but again, it comes back to getting housing delivered as well. And I can think of, you know, a site very close to me being delivered by a social landlord. It's the last person moved out 10 years ago. They'll finally get the properties built and opened next year. And again, the time to deliver, and that isn't a developer, that was actually a social landlord.
Do you oppose, any of you on the panel, banning a person from letting out more than one room or one spare house? And will you ever consider building housing, which I think is not necessarily a direct question for the three of you, but I think the point is being made, perhaps similar to how you've made it, that there are two twinned problems here.
Yeah.
I think, are they talking about renting out a room in a house? Because that's very different, isn't it, to taking a house off the market to having a lodger, whether you have a long-term lodger or renting out a room under Airbnb.
I think perhaps, I don't want to overread it, is where is the line drawn here? Are you suggesting that you're banning a person from letting out more than one room in their house or a spare house?
I think a lot of it comes down to obviously how you draw the detail, but I think there's a difference between either taking in a lodger or, let's say, an international language student, which is quite common in Torbay, but fundamentally you still, as a family, occupy that home, that property, to literally putting the entire property out as a short-term holiday let, where effectively there's no permanent resident anymore.
And this one's quite fun. Crested, I'm not going to be able to pronounce this probably, but Crested Butte in Colorado passed a town order where any short-let renter must live in town for at least half the year. Would you support that idea in the UK? Does anyone want to jump in on that?
Most of our owners, I mean, one of the things that Jane's been talking about all through this is second homes and holiday lets. And it's one of the things that we must sort of avoid doing, the conflation between second homes and holiday lets. They are not the same thing. We are not in the second home business. And second homes are what they are. They are nothing to do with, we are in the tourism industry, that is what we do. Second homes are nothing to do with us. Most of the people who own one of our properties, we had a study done by Oxford Economics, which came out about 11 months ago. And it showed that most of the people who own our properties live within about 5 miles of that property. If you own one property that you let out because you've watched Homes Under the Hammer and you want to buy an investment property for your retirement, you want it to be close to where you are. And that's one of the key things of our industry, that we have thousands of small business owners putting local jobs and money into local economies. They're not like big hotels where the contracts are made we're in London, but where the contracts are made centrally in London, where the staff are paid minimum wage, etc. These are local people with local businesses.
Wouldn't agree with that portrayal. There are, whilst I'd agree with that on some of the chains, there are some bigger hotels in Torbay that are family owned and don't.
There are indeed, but there are also lots of, in the hotel sector, big chain hotels. That is the nature of the hotel industry.
It's not the whole thing.
It's not the whole thing, but then if the holiday let industry is not one thing either. The holiday let industry is a very dynamic, changing industry with small operators. We have some property management companies. We have people who own 3 or 4 buildings. Most of them, and the research that we've had done by Oxford Economics shows that most of them own one property, and it is within 5 miles of where they live.
I think a lot of the issue that we've had has been that conflation with second homes and people who are renting houses out as a holiday business, because it's been so easy to exploit that loophole and say you are renting out for a certain period of time where you aren't in actual fact. And I think the issue of those COVID grants and the fact of that £170 million worth of grants and 100 million of that actually going out of Cornwall shows that, yes, a lot of people living locally own those properties, but there are an awful lot that are owned by people all over the country. For all sorts of reasons. So it's much more complex. There are all sorts of mixtures of things going on.
I would just, as a personal thing, I know lots of people got COVID grants. I had 3 holiday lets in South Wales during COVID. I'm very happy to show you my statement from the Welsh Government of how much I got. I got £62.17. No furlough money and nothing else. Because of the way that most holiday let owners have their businesses set up, we got no help at all. So the ones who did, good for them. But a lot of holiday let owners fall into the small business owner trap, and we got nothing at all. And that's why the government's help with VAT and the Eat Out to help out did absolutely nothing for our industry.
Well, thanks very much. We're going to have to wrap it up because I can see the Minister standing on the side, but I'll close it with a cruel binary question, which is on the Slido. I'm going to slightly rephrase it. Which is more important in your constituencies to solve the problems that you've talked about? Short-term let's action or just building more houses? Kevin?
It's probably short-term let's action. We do need to deal with it.
In Cornwall, I would probably say short-term lets at the moment, but we desperately need those affordable and social housing.
It's not an either or.
And which do you think is more the cause of the problems? I'm not sure I can guess.
The cause of the problem is this government and its abandoning of its own house building targets. I think there should have been more. If we had housing ministers who had been in power or position for longer, this would never have happened. It is a travesty that the government has abandoned its own house building targets. We have to reinstate them, and we have to build the houses that people need so that everyone has a home to live in.
Well, I can see what you've done there, Andy. You've created a neat and slightly awkward segue into the next section, which is my colleague Rosa Prince with Housing Minister Lee Rowley. So if you bear with us, we're going to do a slight rearranging of the stage, and thanks very much for listening.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much to Dan and to the panel for a really interesting discussion. My name, as Dan said, is Rosa Prince. I'm the editor of Politico's London Playbook morning email. And I'm so pleased to have the Minister Lee Rowley, particularly after that introduction, to address some of these questions. As Lee reminded me, he's pretty new to the brief, which is, let me get the exact title, he is the Minister of State for Housing and Planning. And also just to remind you that often some of the measures that we think that we need action on that are most associated with housing actually don't come under your department, do they? All these things are interlinked, as Kate Day said at the beginning of our gathering. But he's kind enough, he's here as a minister of this government, so he's going to be pretty wide-ranging, I believe.
Right.
So yeah, why don't we start where we left off, really? I think that many of the things we are discussing today come down to a simple fact, which is that we haven't built enough homes. Your party's been in government for the last 13 and a half years. Why have those targets been scrapped? Why haven't you built those homes?
Well, it is absolutely the case that we have a shortfall in terms of the number of houses compared to how population has grown. But if you stand back, and there's a tendency in modern life, particularly in the last 10 years or so, everything is a crisis, everything is a problem. You know, that if you look at the record, which has happened since 2010, without getting too political, straight up, we have raised house building on average years significantly. It was in the hundreds in about 10 years ago. It's now clearly in the 200s. We've got a big challenge coming in terms of the economic issues which are in front of us, but it has significantly improved. Home ownership is starting to tick up again. Number of first-time buyers in recent years has gone up. So whilst there is clearly an issue, it is also the case that we have built a significant number of homes, and some of the trends are in the right direction, albeit recognising that there's going to be a challenge coming. And our promise was to build 1 million homes this Parliament. I think we're going to get to 1 million homes by the end of this Parliament. So it is not for want of a significant number of properties that are being built, which then opens up the dream of home ownership. It puts roofs over people's heads. So there's a lot that's been done.
Okay, and what about that suggestion, which I think probably everyone in this room feels, that housing has become a bit of a Cinderella subject, that the governments haven't paid it the attention it deserves, that this is something that's really important to voters, yet somehow falls between different stools. The symbolism of there being this revolving door of housing ministers. Why are you number 16? Why haven't governments given this the importance and paid it the attention that it deserves?
Well, I'm number 16, but I'm also number 13. So I've come back.
Right.
So there is a little bit more to it. I mean, I can't comment. Clearly, we have gone through, as many Western democracies have gone through, a series of tumultuous times. You know, that is a trend across Western democracies. So difficult for me to focus on the changeover of people. But I do know, in terms of all the people that have been through recently, they have put an incredible amount of work. My predecessor, Rachel McLean, was incredibly well respected around the sector for having really focused on trying to move the dial. Michael Gove, Secretary of State, my boss, is pretty universally accepted to be one of the most capable people in government. So there is a significant amount of effort, attention, work, policy development that has gone on, notwithstanding the easy sort of question about the number of people who've been in post, nor do I really think that there's been a lack of focus on it. I mean, if we go back to the point, we have built an awful lot of houses over the last 5 years or so, highest rates for however most of my life. So there's been a substantial supply coming on, but housing is a function of population. We don't have that conversation very often. Population is a function of the policy choices we make. So yes, supply is hugely important, but it has to be contextualised within a wider decision around policy.
Thank you. Now, I should say, you're all part of the conversation, so please do submit questions. I've got my little iPad here. So yeah, we're on Slido, as you know. I think the information for how to take part is on the screen. So please do shoot the minister some questions. I'll do one more before I start to take some of those. I know that you mentioned your boss, Michael Gove. We had the cabinet readout this morning, and Mr. Gove updated the Cabinet on the long-term plan for housing. Can you give us a little hint into what he said? What is the long-term plan for housing? How are we going to start building?
So, I mean, we need to continue to try and support as much housing growth as we possibly can. Housing has to be in the right place. That is always the challenge that I see in my constituency and so many colleagues see in other constituencies. At the same time, we have come forward and said we're going to reform the planning system. So there's going to be an update to the National Planning Policy Framework in the not too distant future. We're also looking about how we can expand particularly important parts of the country. We've been talking about Cambridge, London, elsewhere, and also densifying our cities. So it's a combination of building more homes. We clearly need that. It is also building them in the right place, and it's also looking at the densification of specific areas so that we can make progress when that aligns with other things. Cambridge, hugely important scientific area, needs additional space, both housing, needs additional laboratory space, trying to find ways in which we can bring together those kind of different needs so it works for long term, both for the country and then for the individual areas. And
is there too much red tape? Is that one of the problems?
It's fair to say there is. I mean, anything has red tape, right? I mean, I'm a conservative. I want to reduce the amount that's there. Much of it is there for good reason, but we need to try and work through how we reduce where it is proportionate and reasonable to do so, and then make sure we get applications through the system. So if I take an area which I have been focusing on for longer than the 3 weeks I've been in post or back in post, so I've been responsible for the higher end of the planning system, for the infrastructure part, the NSIP part for the last year or so, and we have a massive programme of work going on in the nationally significant space, wind farms, nuclear, big road projects, et cetera, where we are absolutely trying to reduce the amount of time it takes to go through the process. And we looked at every bit of the process, and the average time at points now is approaching 4 years. We're trying to bring that back down to 2.5 years for these huge projects. And we've made a huge amount of progress. More capacity, streamlined processes, making sure that things can get through quicker. So there is a lot of work going on, both in the top space and then the reforms, which I hope we will be coming out with in the relatively near future in the NPPF, I hope will demonstrate some movement in that direction as well.
What about your colleagues? I mean, some Conservative backbenchers, I don't want to use the word NIMBY lightly, but I guess they're reluctant to see building in their constituencies. Perhaps all MPs have a bit of that. Is that a problem?
Well, I'm not a massive fan of the, this is not an argument with the question, by the way. I'm not a massive fan of the sort of YIMBY-NIMBY binary. I don't think it gives the nuance within that discussion. It is perfectly reasonable, and I am expecting the silly articles to come in the not too distant future, which says, "Oh, housing minister is opposing an application in his own constituency," or "Housing minister opposing an application in my own constituency." Absolutely true. I will do that. I have said where I don't think houses are the right place to put things, I will stand up for my constituents to do that. That is not inconsistent with still wanting more houses to be built. And in the same way that we can't say yes to everything, because if we said yes to everything, we'd have 100-storey skyscrapers in the middle of the Greenbelt, we can't say no to everything either. And it's about having that nuanced conversation with local areas and with local people to make sure that's the case. In my constituency, which is pretty grumpy about what it's gone through in the past 10, 15 years, which was a bad council failing to put in place a local plan, which resulted in thousands more homes than should have been, I can understand why they're grumpy about house building. But what we need to do, instead of just saying, oh, they're NIMBYs, they're not NIMBYs, they're people who could have been treated better, could have been treated like adults, and where a conversation could have been had earlier, which would have allowed these kind of trade-off conversations to be had. So my job as the local MP, as opposed to the housing minister, is try to move that conversation in the right direction. And I think a lot of my colleagues see a similar thing, that it hasn't worked in certain areas and we have to try and improve it. And so both having better local conversations and then reforms at the national level, hopefully, will allow us to make progress.
Thank you. Question here from Anonymous. Should we redesignate parts of the Greenbelt as well as building on the Greenbelt?
A very neutral question there. The Greenbelt is, rightly or wrongly, an extremely important and salient thing for many people when you get out into the places where the Greenbelt is present. I'm 38% Greenbelt, if I remember correctly, in terms of my constituency. It is hugely, so I speak with some experience, it's hugely important. There is a high degree of overlap in the Greenbelt between areas that we would all objectively and subjectively say are important to keep, outstanding areas of beauty and the like, which means that there is great value in the Greenbelt, even when you get the historians in and they talk about what the original purpose of the Greenbelt was. So the NPPF is very clear that the Greenbelt should be protected. I'm in support of the Greenbelt being protected. It is then for individual areas to make decisions about whether there are bits of the Greenbelt which are not the right, which potentially not could be released. And I'll let individual local areas do that. So it's a bit of a combination from me of saying, the Greenbelt, there's a more nuanced conversation that needs to be had about the importance of Greenbelt, and it is very important to people, quite rightly. So I think we should acknowledge the importance of it, and then we should let local areas work out if there are areas which they want to change in any way.
Thank you. Another question on here from Anonymous again, not the same Anonymous, I think. How many of these new homes are and will be social housing? And I'll add a bit, is there enough being done to ensure that sufficient social housing is being built?
So I think there were some new figures that came out on social housing just a few days ago, 62,000, I think it was, or 64,000 completions in the last year, highest since 2015, 74,000 starts against the highest since 2014, 2015, something like that. So again, progress. But as with everything in politics, I mean, politics is the art of both matching infinite and very worthy demands with very finite resources, and it's also the art of incrementally moving in the right direction rather than making massive change very quickly, which is always very difficult. So what I would, from my sense of where we are, is we are moving in the right direction. What we've got to make sure is the economic challenges that all around the world we're seeing at the moment, a normalisation of interest rates, challenges with obtaining credit, and making sure that the supply chains are still in place following a period of high inflation and macroeconomic shocks, that we can continue to make progress through that period whilst we adjust the market to be able to then grow again.
I know that you've been doing some work on leasehold, which it's on my list and one of the questions here. It's going to apply to new build houses, not so much for flats. Shouldn't tenants of flats deserve the same liberation from feudalism that Michael Gove described as house owners?
Well, we introduced the bill to Parliament last Monday, and we'll be going through its processes pretty soon. I think, and I spent 8 years as a councillor in an area that had quite a significant amount of leaseholds in the northwest of London. So I've seen the challenges, I've seen the problems firsthand as a ward councillor for 8 years. I think this bill is a huge step forward, both in terms of headlines, such as precluding the use of leasehold in housing, but also there is a significant transformation going on in terms of flats, a significant move towards greater powers, greater transparency for leaseholders, and I think it's a big step forward. And when I talk to people who have read the bill, I think they all say varying degrees of favour, and some of them say it publicly, some of them are saying it privately. They all accept that this is a significant step forward. They also say it's a long time coming, but we're here and we're making it move and we're going to go as quickly as we can on it. And I think it will be a really important milestone in making sure that the balance is struck more in the favour of the leaseholder, which is important.
Thank you. Let's move on to renting. The Renters Reform Bill, as you know, there's plans to end no-fault evictions, but there was disappointment that this won't happen straight away, and we've sort of got this slightly odd form of words, which is when the court system is reformed to allow this to happen. Is that because there are lots of Tory MPs who are landlords themselves?
No, I mean, I should say, I'm not a landlord, by the way, but I should say that it's my colleague who's taken that through Parliament, and Jacob Young, he's been doing an absolutely fantastic job in doing that. This is about making sure that policies work. This is about recognising there are trade-offs. This is about reality. My view, without getting too existential and too broad, is that too much of politics in the time I've been an adult, since the 1990s, does not anchor itself in the reality of what is actually happening. And when that actually happens, when we bring forward policies that say, well, we want to do this, we've also got to make sure all these things are working, and we've got to make sure that it aligns with X, Y, Z, people go, oh, well, what does that mean? Well, it just means we're trying to make sure the policy works.
So the reality is that you can't get it through the party without having this fudge, or?
No, I think we are bringing forward this proposal, and we're making sure that when it starts working, it works in a way that makes sure the courts can respond to that there's enough capacity, et cetera, et cetera.
So when would you say it will come in? When will we see an end to no-fault evictions?
We've got to get it through the House of Commons and the House of Lords first, and my friends in the upper place are being increasingly interested in slowing legislation down, so we just need to get it through the legislative process.
Before an election?
As soon as we possibly can.
Okay, I think that's about as far as I'm going to get you. Okay, well, talking of those landlords, are we creating too many disincentives for landlords? I mean, it can be quite tough if you're, somebody who owns perhaps 1, 2 properties, all the new rules that are coming in. Would anyone want to even be a landlord again?
Well, I hope so. I mean, it's got to strike a balance, but ultimately, we want people to be able to use their capital in the way that they see fit. That's a fundamental principle of a property-owning democracy and a capitalist system, which I support and which helps make progress over the long term. And we need landlords who are effective. We need landlords who are providing the properties that people can rent when they need to do that. It provides flexibility in the market. It responds to immediate need. It supports those who require it. And I think if we can, there's been a significant growth in the private rented sector over the past 20 or 30 years. That has been positive, but it's also created other challenges. There are some reforms we're bringing forward, but I still hope the right balance can be struck.
Yeah, and some of those challenges are getting pretty acute. So we've got situations in places like London where, young kids are turning up trying to get a house or a flat, and they're, in a line and they're outbidding each other with their deposits. In other places, you've got homes that are in pretty poor condition, and landlords aren't really being held to make them the way they are. I mean, it seems to many people the rental system is kind of close to being broken. Would you agree?
Well, obviously, I wouldn't describe it in that way. I mean, there has been pressure on rent prices in the past couple of years. We may start to see the topping out of that. I've seen some initial indications that rental prices are starting to stabilise in certain areas. There is clearly a challenge in some parts of the country. We have to build more houses. We have to densify parts of cities, which some of the most dense parts of the city of London. When I was a councillor, they are some of the most beautiful parts. Some of the most dense parts are those in Chelsea and the like. So there is an ability to do this in a way which works. But we also have to recognise that housing is, as I said right at the beginning, housing is a function of population. So everybody who is seeing challenge also has to say, why is that challenge in front of us? And it can't just be that we build forever, much as we do need to build more houses. It also has to be a recognition that other policy decisions have an impact. And I hope when they make that consideration, draw that conclusion, they're also thinking through how these different policies interact. Because on the one hand, they can't say one thing, and then on the other, see a consequence of that thing and say, I don't like it. That's not how it works. That's not how policy works.
I know there was action in the autumn statement to end the freeze on local housing allowances, which I think have been welcomed by many people in this room. Let's talk about people who do fall through the cracks. Do you think homelessness is a lifestyle choice?
No. I'll let Suella make her own comments. Having been a councillor for 8 years, having been an MP now for 6.5 years, I deal every week with people who are in really desperate need. And it's important that we make the system work. No system is perfect, but the system does work in most instances. I see that locally. I'm starting to see that in terms of one of my roles as a housing minister. What we have to do is also work through, on a broader macro level, how we reduce this issue over time. And part of that will be supply. Part of that will be working out why people are in need in the first place. And then part of it will be trying to find ways to change policy to be able to support people. So I'll choose my own words, but recognising there is a challenge, but also recognising a lot of work going on led by the Secretary of State and others in government to try and solve that.
And would you want to stop homeless people being given tents by charities or authorities?
I think my sense of the challenge with regards to rough sleeping is when I was a councillor in London, and we went through this incredible detail, this was a number of years ago, it became pretty clear that there is a combination of both people who need immediate support and then people who have very, very, very deep-seated vulnerabilities. And as a compassionate society, we need to try and work with people to try and help them move on, to try and find ways to move that along. When I go and talk in my constituency, or in the town near my constituency, it is the case that a lot of people who look as though they are rough sleeping actually do have properties. And so what I think we need to look at, as well as trying to make sure that we are supporting people to find those pathways and those ladders out, is recognising there's a significant amount of health issues here, significant amount of mental health issues, significant amount of addiction issues, and work through in a compassionate way to try and help people take the first steps, which means they won't need to be on the streets in the first place.
Didn't quite answer the question though. What about whether or not someone should be given a tent or if that is a nuisance?
But in the nicest possible way, it's not a serious question. The serious question is, how do we look at things on a macro level to try and fix them, to try and resolve the policy over the long term? And, you know, what somebody said on a tweet a month ago is not how we fix things for people who are in need, nor how we fix the issues across housing for the long term.
Thank you so much. That was such an interesting discussion. Really, really appreciate it. And thank you all for your questions as well. We're going to have some time for networking, some coffees and teas, and I believe some cake. So please do enjoy and then come back and join us for our final panel discussion after that. Thank you. Thank you so much. Is that all right? Yeah, okay, brilliant. Thank you.
last decade, we've become the third largest tech economy in the world after the US and China.
Relish the prospect of going toe-to-toe with this government on saying who can make this transition work economically for the British people.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me? Yeah. Great. Welcome back after the break to the second half of this event. My name is Eleni Correa. I'm one of the authors of Politico's London Playbook. You've met my two colleagues today, Rosa and Dan. I'm the third one. Thanks again for coming to this event. We've already heard lots about why housing policy is such an important issue, such a topical issue, and it's very likely to be a big general election battleground. And it's not clear that either the Tories or the Labour Party have clear answers about what they're going to do to resolve the UK's housing shortage. It's great to be here today with Amanda Couples, who's General Manager of Airbnb in Northern Europe. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome her to the stage, and we're going to have a short interview before moving on to the next panel. So, welcome, Amanda.
Looking at me very, yeah.
I guess my first question to you, and in a sense it might be the hardest question, is about what we've heard today. So we've heard at the panel earlier from MPs, from campaign groups, from others, that Airbnb and other short-term letting platforms are exacerbating the housing crisis, even sort of hollowing out coastal communities in the UK. What's your response to that? Do you accept that narrative?
I think what I would say is, we clearly do have a housing crisis in this country. And Airbnb is not about exacerbating housing crisis. It was born in an economic recession. The foundation stone of Airbnb is about allowing people to host, to earn extra money, to make ends meet, and to make a really unique contribution to the tourism sector that is all about dispersing travel, unlocking tourism in places where it couldn't otherwise flourish, and really making sure that the benefits of tourism stay in communities. I think what we do acknowledge is, as I said, that there is a housing crisis in this country. Short-term lets at the moment are effectively a black box in terms of their impact on housing. We know very little. This is one of the reasons that as Airbnb, we have really led the call to regulate this sector. It's something we're very, very, very keen to do. We're pleased that we're making progress on it so far, and we're very, very hopeful that the government will complete its legislative program on this topic before who knows what happens next year. But I think for us, it is about how can we be a positive force and part of the solution to these very real issues on housing rather than being a problem.
And just to press you on that, I can see here one of the most popular questions we've had today is whether you think it's ironic to have Airbnb sponsor an event that's about the housing crisis, given that what we've heard.
Well, I mean, no. What I would say is that, again, we want to be part of the solution. Housing is complex. Short-term lets are one actually quite small part of the housing sector. Airbnb stock is less than 1% of all housing stock in this country. However, they're an important part, and there's absolutely no doubt that the regulation of short-term lets is really, from our perspective, the key thing that has to be unlocked to answer the question. And you heard the first panel talk about, we need to strike a balance. We need to strike a balance. We absolutely agree. There does need to be a balance struck between the very real positive impacts of tourism, both on the economy kind of at a macro level, but also on a lot of individuals in this country who make their livelihood from tourism. We did some independent research last year. Activity on Airbnb supported over 107,000 British jobs last year, often in places where there aren't any other industries. And so there is a balance to be struck. From a short-term lets perspective, we think that regulatory solution is a really important part of the unlock. But we are one part of the sector. And from our perspective, it was really important to convene this forum here today with players from other parts of the housing sector, regulators and other participants, to start to have a conversation about what does a modern housing sector look like, what are the solutions, and how do we all as participants, including us as a short-term letting platform, participate in that to make it happen.
And just to turn the tables a little bit on that, so do you think the government's actions in the short-lets industry and what the regulations that they are consulting on bringing in, do you think what the government is doing is basically an attempt to deflect attention from their own failures to build more housing?
Well, I like to stay in my own lane on these things. So what I will say is that we are very pleased that this regulation is proceeding. We've been calling for it for a number of years. We've published white papers. We are on the record multiple times as saying that this is needed. I think that, you know, for us, the most important part is the registration. And the reason the registration is so important is because it's very clear that there is this real data deficit on short-term lets in the UK. And it's really important that we have good data and good evidence to support good policy making. And we're very, very supportive of giving local authorities the tools they need to make those decisions, and we think it's right that the government should be thinking about, you know, what are those levers? Are they planning controls? Is it taxation? It's not for us to say as Airbnb. So I think really our focus has been on getting this registration system implemented in a way that will preserve the benefits of tourism, the benefits of hosting. 8 out of 10 of our hosts have one listing, one property. You know, we are in a cost of living crisis. People are using hosting really as a way to help them make ends meet, to pay their mortgage, to pay their heating bills, et cetera, et cetera. We think it's really critical that to make good policy, you go through, you do the registration system, you get the evidence, you understand the impact on housing supply, and then make rational, objective policy decisions in the area. So that's just been our focus. As I said, we're very pleased that the legislative program is proceeding, and I hope we will get to a conclusion soon.
Mm-hmm. And just to follow on from what you were saying, have you seen any evidence that in cities and places where there's been a sort of crackdown on short lets and Airbnb, have you seen any signs that people are actually selling their houses because they can't afford them, given that they can't let them out?
I am not aware of any evidence that crackdowns on short-term lets has had a real impact on housing supply. I think what we do see really clearly is that it has a huge impact on tourism, and it's very, very clear where, you know, what the short-term letting sector does is provide a really affordable alternative to traditional hospitality. It disperses the benefits of tourism and hospitality, often to parts of cities that don't traditionally benefit from tourism. And if you remove that, kind of what happens is prices go up. Tourism, ironically, gets even more concentrated in areas that have, you know, a lot of traditional hospitality businesses, and people lose their livelihood. So people who, you know, particularly outer boroughs in cities, small businesses in those areas, they lose their livelihood. That is what we clearly see.
Mm-hmm. And so taking a step back, you know, all of this is happening in the current political context. We're going to have a general election probably sometime in the next year. Labour is currently 18 points ahead in the polls on average. What meetings have you had with Labour recently, and what are they telling you about their plans for?
Well, I think, you know, we have engaged with both the current government and the opposition. And, you know, I think our engagement with Labour kind of predates the polls. We talk to constituency MPs from across the political spectrum constantly, and we have very, very constructive dialogue with them. I think in terms of Labour's position, what we're very optimistic about is that they understand the benefits and the importance of tourism to the British economy, and they understand the positive benefits that hosting can bring, you know, as both an economic and a social force. We're hopeful that, as I said, maybe we'll have some regulation before an election. If we don't, or indeed if we do, we will continue to engage
with Labour on all of these topics.
Have you had any recent meetings with their shadow housing secretary, for example?
I won't comment on that.
And turning back to the government, is it unhelpful how much turnover there's been in that portfolio? I think we've already discussed 16 housing ministers in 13 years.
Yeah, I mean, clearly volatility in government has a cost, you know, it's a lot of new people and a lot of new faces. That said, the machinery of government kind of survives ministerial changes, and I think all I can really say on that is regulation of short-term lets has proceeded. We're hopeful that it will continue to proceed, and we engage with who we need to engage with.
Thank you. Thanks, Amanda. That's all we have time for on this panel, but my colleague Rosa Prince is about to chair the next event, which is a panel discussion on housing, what needs to change. So if you wouldn't mind please staying seated, we're going to carry out a quick stage change. Thank you. Please.
Welcome back, everyone, and this is our final session of the day, and I'm so pleased to have this excellent panel. We're going to be discussing housing policy and what needs to change is the title of this discussion. I'm really pleased to have Sharon Taylor. She says I don't need to call her Baroness, so that's nice because we're always quite informal at Politico. Sharon is a member of the Levelling Up Housing Communities team for the Labour Party in the House of Lords. We have Kath Scanlon, who's a Distinguished Policy Fellow and Deputy Director at the LSE. She's also done some really interesting research for Airbnb, which I think we're going to discuss a bit. And Ben Beadle is the Chief Executive of the National Residential Landlords Association. Now, as you know, you can keep submitting questions here via Slido. One of the questions we've actually had is why we have no tenants' voice on the panel. Just to say, we did reach out and try to get one, but I'm really more than happy to, if anyone in the audience has particular questions on that front, to put them to the panel and make that very much part of our discussion, because we know it's a really important voice. But why don't we just kick off by jump right in there, being really direct, and ask what would be the one thing you think needs to change in housing policy? You might well be there in government this time next year. What would you be pushing for to change?
Well, first of all, thank you to Politico for putting on this debate and for calling it a housing crisis, because I think that's what it is. And the thing that absolutely would be a game changer is very straightforward, really, and that's get some more housing built. It sounds really obvious. Before I went into the House of Lords, I was a council leader for 17 years, so I've been involved in housing and, both in terms of the casework, so direct contact with tenants. I still am, because I'm still a councillor, but also in making sure that my council had a programme of building. We've built both private and council housing because we use the funds from the private housing to fund the building of the council housing, and we've been quite successful in that. But, at the moment with 1.4 million, I think it is, people on housing waiting lists, we think there's an unmet need in terms of housing of around 8 million people in the country. And we'll have something like 239,000 children homeless this Christmas. There is definitely a housing crisis. We need to get more housing built, and we need to take the communities where that housing will be sited along with us. And I think that's the real challenge. So there are lots of issues around that. But if I'm going to say one thing, my party has a pledge to build 1.5 million homes over the period of the next Parliament. I'm not going to say that's going to be easy, because it will be a challenge, but we think we can get up to around 260,000 a year quite quickly, and that's nowhere near what the government's delivered so far.
Ben, just hopping over to you, are landlords part of the problem, or are they part of the solution to this?
Probably both, to be honest with you. I mean, I would endorse what's been said there. I do wonder how bad it has to become before it becomes a crisis. Whether we like it or not, landlords are part of the solution, but responsible landlords that treat their tenants right and that do things correctly as they're required to do. And for me, that's the majority there. I don't dispute that there are some problems around the edges, but fundamentally, where we're at the moment is a lack of supply, both in social housing and in private rented sector housing. And as I keep making the point to ministers about, actually, we've kind of given up on social housing in this country, it feels like. We then spend our time kicking the private rented sector, and then we miraculously think that people are just going to buy their homes and find somewhere to live, either that or get a tent. And I was appalled to see that the minister couldn't call out that sort of practice early on in his session. That's not a lifestyle choice. That's endemic of a failed policy over many, many years, and it's totally unacceptable. So we do need to invest in social housing, but that will take time. And in the meantime, we need the private rented sector fit for purpose. There is significant areas of challenge, but I'm a supporter of the Renters Reform Bill with the right nips and tucks. We're about responsible landlords doing right by their tenants, and it's very much a homogenous group for me. Good landlords and good tenants, that's where we want to be, and we need to rely on them to deliver the homes that people need.
Thank you. And Kath, I know you've done some research into a really interesting area, which is people who rent out just a spare room in their house. It sounds like it could be a sort of mixed blessing. Is it a good thing? Is it part of the solution?
Well, it was very fascinating research, as you say. Most of what we've been talking about so far today in the session is short-term lets of entire homes. But a significant proportion of what's on Airbnb and other short-term let platforms is people renting out a spare room in a home where they live themselves. And in fact, that was what the company was founded to facilitate. So we did some research that's going to be published next week, hopefully, looking at how that's structured in the UK. And we surveyed 1,500 spare room hosts in this country. And a couple of interesting things. First is that the main motivation, unsurprisingly, is financial. About more than half of the hosts said that the income from those lets was either very or extremely important to their household incomes. But the second big motivation, and it was the main motive for a lot of them, was social, that they enjoyed the company, they enjoyed meeting people from all over the world, and a higher proportion of hosts were either single or widowed or separated than in the population as a whole. So a lot of them were adults living on their own, and they did it because they said they had room and they would be lonely if they didn't have someone else coming to stay. And in terms of what we've been talking about today, one interesting thing was that only quite a small minority of these hosts were themselves tenants. So most of them were owner-occupiers, and that probably reflects the fact that most leases either prohibit this kind of activity entirely or require you to get the permission of the landlord. So can be a good contribution to household income, but not really easy for everyone to do.
Thank you. Ben, we've got a question here from Connor from Generation Rent. We've talked a lot, he says, short-term lettism is having a major impact in cities which are hemorrhaging properties to STLs. Does this require a different response?
Yes, it does. My good friend Connor from Generation Rent, thank you for the question. Yeah, I mean, and I'm very conscious this event is sponsored by Airbnb, but surely it can't be right that government incentivises short-term stag do's and hen parties in holiday lets ahead of long-term sustainable renting, and that's what's happening through the tax system. So landlords, because of the changes to mortgage interest, and especially at the moment, given where we've gone in terms of interest rates, landlords, if you're unincorporated, sorry to be technical so late in the day, but if you're unincorporated, you can't fully offset your mortgage interest as a proper business expense. Well, if you're faced with that position, you might change your business model. That's what happens, and that's exactly what's happening at the moment. But I don't think the solution is to be punitive when it comes to taxation. Actually, what we want to do, particularly given the context of a housing crisis, we want to encourage people to bring their properties to the market. Decent accommodation with, properly vetted landlords and tenants having a good tenancy together. But if it doesn't stack up against the backdrop of a diminishing social housing crisis, this is really, really problematic. And people are voting with their feet at the moment. People are not wanting to come into the market. And we are where we are. I genuinely don't know where people are going to end up living. And it's a huge, huge problem for everybody. It feels to me that government would rather have people on social housing waiting lists or in temporary accommodation than actually address some of the substantive issues going on in the sector. Because as you said, 1.4 million on social housing waiting list. We actually have landlords taking home, and get your violins out, folks. We have landlords taking home their lowest margins since 2007. We have rents at record highs, and we have a record spend and a record number of people in temporary accommodation. There are no winners here, literally no winners.
Sharon, Marie-Claude Hemming from the Civil Engineering Contractors Associations asks, how can we get the infrastructure needed to support new homes before they are built? I mean, it's all very well having 1.5 million homes, but if they don't have the GP surgeries, the schools, all the other things, the transport, then it's sort of useless.
Okay, well, I think I need to declare an interest, and I'm always doing that in the House of Lords, in that I grew up in Stevenage in Hertfordshire, which was Britain's first post-war new town. And new towns were a visionary example of some of the things that the post-war government did. Not everything in them worked, and I'm not naive enough to think that's the case, but one of the things they did do was consider the whole of what a community needed at the same time as the housing. And that's why my party is now looking at a whole new generation of new towns. I could have cried when I heard that news because I'm so pleased about this. Because when I spoke earlier about communities and taking them along with you, I've had my share of knives in my back from the planning process over the years. I'm sure anyone who's been a councillor will have done. But the fears that people have around housing are around the pressure that's put on existing infrastructure and that not being provided for the new housing. Now, when you build a new town, and I'm a great fan of master planning, and the Town and Country Planning Association have been so supportive to those of us in new towns and how we take that forward to a new generation. I was with them yesterday talking about how that might work. But the great advantage to that is you can build new communities with all the infrastructure that a community needs. Of course, it's got to be funded, and that's another issue. And there's only so much Section 106 and Community Infrastructure Levy, or Infrastructure Levy, as it's going to be called, that any development will bear. So I do think the government has to take its share in delivering infrastructure to sit alongside. But when you do it at scale, it's much easier to do it than if you're sticking on, a big development on the edge of an existing development. And too many of them have been like that. I've been to lots and lots of them around the country. So, and just picking up the points about social housing, we need to include social housing in those developments, as well as private housing. I know that, you know, a lot of people in this country are very keen to be owner-occupiers, and, you know, we would want to support that. But there's been about 130,000 social homes built over the last 12 years, but there have been 300,000 demolished or sold off under right to buy. So we've, you know, the stock's gone. So if you build social housing, you've got to have a provision. I'm not, you know, we will continue to support right to buy, but you've got to have a one-for-one replacement. If you sell a social property off, you've got to replace it with another one.
Thank you. We've got a question here from someone who's sent it in anonymously, saying that 62% of Airbnbs in London are whole properties, 54,500 homes taken away from long-term housing. Would the panel welcome New York City-style regulation to prevent this? Why do you take that one, Kath?
Well, London is the place with the highest number of Airbnb rentals of all kinds, both whole homes and spare rooms. And the place where they cause the most issues is in places where housing costs are already high and housing supply is tight, and tourist areas, and London is both of those things. So especially in the inner London boroughs where, you know, there's very, very limited land, any housing unit that is being used full-time as an Airbnb or a short-term let is almost by definition taken out of the permanent housing supply, and that clearly is a huge issue in a city that faces a housing crisis like ours does. How to address that is a much more difficult policy challenge. Cities all around the world have been looking at ways to deal with this. It's ranging from outright bans to limits of the number of nights. There's lots of different policy approaches. One of the challenges is it can be quite hard to enforce. I know a lot of the letting platforms, including Airbnb, work hand in hand with the authorities to try to design systems that allow them to monitor what's going on. But it's understandable why there are concerns about this.
We have another really interesting question, actually, given the subject is in the news a lot this week. Any considerations regarding the link between immigration and tight housing markets? I'd quite like to hear from all of you on this one. Ben, is that something that, as landlords, you think about?
Yeah, well, to be careful how I approach this because I'm not an immigration expert, but it's, you know, we don't have the right number of homes to cater for people here, whether you take immigration into account or not. And so for me, you know, what we've seen with resettlement schemes, for example, is we've seen government lean on the goodwill of homeowners and private landlords rather than address some of the longer term systemic issues in the sector. All I want to know is if, for whatever reason, I was caught up in a war-torn place, I hope that there would be a country that would offer me sanctuary and would look after me and my family, and we should be doing the same. But I do understand the concerns that people have about prioritisation and, you know, how that plays out and is perceived, and it's very, very tricky, particularly against the backdrop of not having enough homes in the first place. So, you know, rather than, you know, banning things and setting thresholds, actually I'd rather be dealing with some of the root causes of what we see in our sector, which is to build social homes, which is actually not to ban people renting to Airbnb, for example, but to make it more attractive to rent your home to a family, for example, or to rent to somebody who's on universal credit or local housing allowance. We don't have to be interventionist in a legislative sense that gives the perception of something being very difficult. We just need to nudge the right sorts of behaviour. Surely we'd rather spend a few quid on tax breaks to incentivise the right sort of behaviour than to have people in temporary accommodation, for example.
Sorry, go ahead, Kath.
Could I weigh in on something about that? I think one of the clear things about both the housing market and immigration is both of them point to the really dramatic over-centralization of this country around London and southern England, that this is where housing pressures are the highest, housing costs are the highest. We're talking here about a housing crisis that is obviously self-evident to everybody who's in this room, but if we were in a lot of the north of England, there isn't a housing crisis. Similarly, if you look at where migrants tend to gravitate to when they come to this country, they gravitate to London. So it increases those pressures. So I think over the long term, one way to help alleviate these pressures would be to change the over-centralization of the economy, the governance system that makes everything happen in London. And I was having a conversation in the break with somebody from Newcastle who said, he's like Newcastle, couldn't stay there because he couldn't find a job because he had to be in London. So.
And that's not an easy thing. We'll just change that.
No, I know it's not an easy thing, but you can't look at these things in isolation.
Sharon, do you think that the discourse around immigration is fueled by things like the lack of housing supply and the pressures that immigration puts on housing supply?
Well, first of all, on that point, I think there's room for a mass-scale, much more devolution than we currently have. Not only is our housing and our economy centralised, but so is our governance. And I think we need to have a much greater range of devolution, much more powers for planning and housing and everything else for the people that know their local areas and work in their local areas. I think the recent discourse on immigration has been very unhelpful. Like Ben, I'd like to think if my children are all grown up now, but when they were younger, if I needed to flee from somewhere where it was impossible to live, that there would be somewhere welcoming that I could go. But the other thing is, when we look at our public services in this country, not just public services, in the private sector as well, huge numbers of people who come to this country from outside support those public services and always have done for generations. And they become part of this country's fabric and supporting the life of everyone else that lives here. And to use immigration as a sort of dog whistle against what is a housing crisis, and I think that has been done, is really an approach that it makes people feel that it's because asylum seekers come into this country that they can't get housing. It's nothing to do with that. It's because not enough housing has been built that people can't get housing. And it's about time we turned that corner, started to accept the problem for what it is, which is an absolute housing crisis, and provide the support to see families living in hotels, which a lot of families that come to this country have to for months on end. It doesn't do those families any good, and it doesn't do the community any good either. They should be out there, doing what they want to do in our community and being part of our community. So I hope we can turn that corner.
Thank you. And another question for all three of you, and this is from Andrew Funk, who is a homeless entrepreneur. He asked, how can the three panellists collaborate to improve the state of housing for all the children, families and single individuals experiencing homelessness in the UK? Now, the Minister sort of didn't want to make homelessness almost about housing, did he? He sort of wanted to broaden it out to be about mental health and other issues, which of course I'm sure are part of the picture. But do you agree with him, or maybe I'll go straight to you?
I was talking to Andrew earlier, and he's looked at homelessness all over the world, and it's the issues. It's wherever you are, homelessness is an issue, but he was particularly interested in how we deal with it in this country. In my role as a council leader, we developed a whole housing first policy, which meant making sure people have a roof over their head. We've used a mixture of MMC, so modern method of construction housing, and we've built a whole new unit recently of a 29-room. They're all independent units, so they're all self-contained. And we give a whole package of support that goes with them to help homelessness people with whatever their issues are that have led to them being homelessness. It can be drug, alcohol, other addictions. It can be mental health. It can be financial capability. It can be a whole mixture of all of those. But, you know, making sure that they get access to support with that while they've got a roof over their head, so they can, you know, make sure they're fit to or ready to make a change to their life, has been really important to us. And, you know, homelessness is absolutely part of the housing crisis. The number of homeless people I speak to who, you know, quite often it will be a relationship breakup, for example, nothing to do with any issues of complex needs in their life. They have a relationship breakup, and then one side of the partnership doesn't get housing, the other side does, and then you've got a problem on your hands. So I think we've got to look at this in a much more holistic way. And I think we need to do far more. I can remember, this was many years ago now, so I don't want to point the finger at my council, but many years ago, they came to me with a homelessness policy. And I said to them, how many homeless people have you included talking about this policy before you've brought it to us? And they hadn't talked to any homeless people at all. So I think it's really important that we engage a whole variety of people, because they're all homeless for different reasons, as we put our housing policy or our homelessness policies together. But leaving people on the streets in this century is totally unacceptable. One of my big missions with the Levelling Up Bill was to get rid of the Vagrancy Act, which has been there since 1824 and criminalises homeless people. It criminalised 2,000 people last year. We still haven't scrapped it. We didn't get the government to do it as part of the Levelling Up Bill. They've promised us they'll do it within 12 months. No sign of it so far, but I shall keep on the case of that. It's not criminal to be homeless. It's because, you know, you've had some problems that you haven't been able to deal with.
What about you, Kath? What would you like to see happening on this area?
Well, one of the really shocking things about the homelessness situation is that local authorities have a duty to house many homeless families, and in a lot of places there's no social housing, so they put them in so-called temporary accommodation, which can be temporary temporary is the wrong word. I've interviewed people who had been living in the same temporary accommodation flat for 12 years, and there was no prospect of them leaving. Now, a lot of this TA is provided by private landlords. So on the one side, the government is brought in a number of tax changes and regulation changes that have the effect of incentivizing landlords to leave the sector or to move into short-term lets. On the other hand, we're relying on them to provide temporary accommodation for homeless households and hopefully longer-term accommodation for these households. Those two things are contradictory.
Yeah, I'm sure Ben would like to speak to that. Are landlords prepared to take, for example, someone on housing benefit? Is that something that they've traditionally been a bit wary of?
Well, yes, and to be clear, no landlord should discriminate on any circumstances, let alone housing benefit or universal credit or families or kids. Let's just get that out there straight away. But the reality is, with the supply crisis as it stands, that those marginalised groups or those groups at the bottom of the rung will struggle to find accommodation against a backdrop of 25 applications per property. That's the reality of where we're at, folks, and that's why we do need to take some pretty bold steps to increase housing supply. And you can do that in a number of ways. You can increase social housing and commit to a campaign of one-to-one, which we would absolutely support. That's why we're in this mess, because we flogged it all off and haven't replaced it. And we run the risk of doing the same again with the private rented sector. Obviously, if another landlord buys it, I get it, it doesn't disappear, it stays there. But the problem is that we're shuffling the same pack of cards. We're not increasing the cards, and that's exactly what we need to do to address some of these issues. I don't think I represent landlords that provide temporary accommodation. I see all the same stuff as you. My members provide, on average, 8 properties each in the private rented sector, and I expect them, to do so to a high standard. Otherwise, they have no part to play. The rules around temporary accommodation and the quality that I hear around temporary accommodation is unacceptable. And people should not be living in temporary accommodation for months and years on end. That's just absolutely nonsensical to me. But the way that these things have panned out with greater intervention is that we've sort of driven some of these things. You know, frankly, it's a political decision that people are homeless. We took people in off the streets during COVID. We can do it again if we want to pay for it. It's a political choice. I get that it costs a lot of money, but that's the reality. So the way I see these things panning out are not around banning things or making it, you know, so difficult for people to operate. It's about nudging the right sorts of behaviour, punishing you know, bad behaviour from property owners if they're not doing the right sorts of things, but having a framework that landlords and tenants can exist collectively. And the question was about, you know, collaboration. Actually, the private rented sector has higher satisfaction than the social rented sector, for example. And so, you know, I don't buy this argument that tenants and landlords are in a state of perpetual conflict. I think it's sometimes a very easy place to default to. So we need to put our kind of vested interests to one side. I want a thriving and healthy private rented sector. I think everybody else on the panel does here. There are different ways of achieving it, but sort of kind of failed ideologies and putting them out there are not helpful to the debate. Neither is sort of government messaging around immigration and right to rent checks. You know, we've got a responsibility with our language, and there's a massive opportunity, I think, now to really take some bold steps, because if we don't, I genuinely don't know where people are going to end up living, and that's a real worry to me and everybody in this room, I'm sure.
And staying with this sort of legal framework within which tenants and landlords should be able to coexist. You mentioned that you're sort of broadly on board with the Renters Reform Bill. Do you think it's got the balance right in terms of protecting landlords from, you know, antisocial tenants behaviour? Obviously, the courts are a mess. It's really hard to evict a tenant who trashes your home and doesn't pay rent or whatever. What's your view on that?
Yeah, I mean, we've been very clear on this. Good landlords don't evict tenants willy-nilly, right? There is invariably a reason. I get that a very small minority may not do repairs and may do some sort of revenge eviction. That's totally unacceptable. But I think if you were to delve down into the reasons why people issue Section 21 notices, they would be typically around selling, moving back in, arrears, or antisocial behaviour. As far as I can see from the Renters Reform Bill and what is proposed, the grounds that are listed should allow landlords to get possession of their property for legitimate reasons. I'm fine with that. What I'm not fine with, and the Minister did allude to this around the courts, is that if you are moving to a new system of operating where you are going to need to prove your case and you will need judges to hear and assess the evidence, you need to make sure that that's got the confidence of court users. At the moment, love or loathe Section 21, it does enable landlords to get possession of their property in a way that doesn't take up a lot of court resources. And so it is only right, in my view, that with a legitimate reason and with a revised framework and with the biggest changes that we will have seen in 30 years, that some efforts are made in investing in the court service to give landlords confidence, because there isn't a lot of confidence out there. And against the backdrop, and I should say, I want to keep people in their homes, right? You know, I'm not in the business of endorsing evictions. Obviously, there are cases sometimes where that is necessary. And where that's necessary, a landlord should have a reason. And where they have a reason, a judge will need to test it, and it should proceed promptly. You said that a number of government services are on their knees. I would agree with that, and the court system is one of them. It's a pity they haven't addressed it before now.
Sorry, that's another broken promise this government's made. It promised to ban Section 21 evictions. I appreciate that landlords will want an appropriate system in place to deal with the tenants where there is significant antisocial behaviour or destruction of the property. But since they promised to ban Section 21 evictions, about 70,000 families have been subject to Section 21 evictions. And, you know, what if we're going to improve the way that renting works in this country, we do need to have, you know, looking at Europe, where they have much longer tenures for rented properties, and they have a much more secure tenancy, That's what we're going to have to do here, because it's not going to be possible for everybody to buy a property. And it's the security that really worries me. When I get one of my residents coming to me saying that they've been served a Section 21 notice, they've got to move. The only place, because of the shortage of housing, the only place they can get is the other side of town. That means they don't drive, so that means they've got to change their children's school. They might have, special educational needs support in the school they're in, which they're going to lose. They might lose a job because they can't get to their job from where they are. I mean, this stuff really disrupts people's lives. And I grew up in a council house, and it was a development corporation house actually, and having that secure tenancy was such a boost to my family and all the families that lived around us. There were 30,000+ council houses in Stevenage then. All of those families in those council houses grew up with the knowledge that that was their house for as long as they wanted it for, unless, even in those days, there were things you could do if people didn't look after their properties. So I think that's what we need to get to. We need this security of tenure without the worry of having a Section 21 hanging over you all the time. And the government hasn't done that. And then, sorry to, while I've got the floor, that we've just had the leasehold reform bill put before Parliament, which is supposed to ban leasehold in houses and flats. The government have now said they're not going to ban leasehold in flats because it's too complicated. I asked the minister last week. She said they couldn't do it. It's too complicated. And there is no clause in that bill to ban leasehold in houses either, because the government didn't have time to put it in, apparently. So you've now got a leasehold reform bill intended to ban leasehold that has no clauses in it that ban leasehold of any kind. And then we wonder why we've got a housing crisis.
I'd love to ask you this next question, but I'm conscious that Kath hasn't spoken for a while. So let's have Kath, and then I'll go back to you, which is a lovely question from Anonymous. What does the panel think about rent controls? Sadiq Khan wants them.
Sadiq Khan has been making the case to be given the power to impose rent controls in London or rent regulation in London for quite some time. He doesn't have that power in this very centralized government system that we've been talking about, and perhaps that's one of the things that might change if devolution were to go further. What would happen if rents, what happens under rent control depends to a large extent on how those controls are designed. This is one of those subjects where I know so much about it. It's quite hard to be brief. I will say that in general, it's good for the people who are currently renting. It's bad for the people who would like to rent in the future because it makes landlords less willing to rent their properties, possibly think about exiting the market. And the German system is often pointed to as, here's a place where a system with a country that has rent control and it works very well. That's true, but there are also a lot of things that are different about the German rental sector and the way they own property. That means you can't directly read across to here. So good for existing tenants, bad for future tenants, I would say.
How is it for landlords?
Well, what do you think I'm going to say? So I think on this, look, Sadiq Khan calls for rent controls almost daily, to be honest with you. And what I would say, like a lot of things, that this is very much treating the symptom rather than the cause. And the root cause of high rents is a lack of supply. It's no different to booking a last-minute airplane ticket. If it's almost full, you pay through the nose, as I found out when I got delayed last year from my Christmas party. But enough about that. But the point is, this is a question of supply and demand. And if you deal with the supply issues, actually rents come down. I'm old enough, sadly, to remember when tenants actually negotiated rent decreases at renewal, and that was simply because there was a plentiful supply around 20 years ago, where there was in the area that I was in. And so for me, if we want to stymie and stifle the sector further, by all means, go and bring in rent control. Actually, if we want to have a sensible debate about fair rents and things like that, actually the best way to deal with that is to address the supply challenges that we face. And those supply challenges will be awaiting a Labour government in a year's time, potentially.
So what about you, Sharon? Are you with your Labour
Well, first
colleague,
of all, I agree that the supply is the main issue. I understand why Sadiq Khan says the things he says about rent controls, but there is, you know, the Labour Party doesn't currently have a policy about setting hard and fast rent controls, and that there are lots of pitfalls in terms of setting rent controls. One is, if you're not careful, it ends up being a ceiling that, you know, which might make some rents go up. So you've got to be very careful about that. And the issue about supplying the private sector is really important, because most landlords, in my experience as a councillor and a council leader, most landlords do a very good job of looking after their properties and looking after their tenants, and they should get a return for that. In terms of social landlords, the rents are considerably lower in the social rented housing sector already. My concern is a different one in the social rented housing sector, because we've had rent freezes for quite a long time, and that's meant that we haven't been able to keep up with some of the repairs and maintenance work we need to do. Certainly not enough spare in there for building, so I think we've got to be careful about that side of things as well. But we don't have a policy about hard rent controls. There was an example in Scotland where it actually pushed rents up when it was introduced in Scotland, so we do have to be very careful about that.
And when our time is nearly up, so why don't we have one quick answer from each of you, just a sentence, going back to the topic, which was what needs to change. If you're sitting there, you're in your first few days in the new Labour government, what would be the one thing you'd put into a housing bill?
Well, I've talked about the housing supply, and we do need to address the planning issues around that. But one of the things I'd like us to do far more than we do is talk to a wide range of people, but particularly the generation that are really struggling at the moment, you know, the people who are trying to get into the housing market. Talk to them far more about what they want. There was an interesting question on your briefing papers around what housing will look like in the future, and they may not want housing to look like what I might want it to look like, for example. So I think it's very important, and certainly that was true of our homeless cohort, who had a very different view of what they wanted from housing. And I've just done a big consultation on older people's housing, and their view didn't come out the way I expected it to either. So I think it's very important that we do this work, and we look to countries where, in Europe and other places, where they've had a better go at keeping the housing market more buoyant than it is here, about how they've managed to do that. And then we'll avoid some of the pitfalls. I do want to see this new generation of new towns, though, because looking at housing in the round with everything else that a community needs is really, really important. And I look forward to, if we do have the privilege of being elected into government, I'll look forward to taking that forward from my generation, where I benefited from it, to another generation.
And Kath, how about you? What would be the one thing you'd like a government to do?
Well, I second the idea of new towns. I think it's crazy that there's been decades when we haven't had any new towns. The other thing that's worth looking at, a lot of American cities have taken away the limits on what they call accessory dwelling units, which basically means granny flats, and said they can be built without planning permission on your own land. So you can build a little self-contained house, either as an annex to your own house or at the bottom of your garden. Been very successful in places like Seattle.
Thank you. Ben, what's your one measure?
A long-term strategy, less division, less rhetoric.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone on the panel for a really interesting discussion. And thank you to all your questions too.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. It's been such an interesting afternoon. I feel like we could have gone on for days with so many different things coming up, from rent controls to immigration to, whether we build new towns and cities and what the role of government should be. I'm sure we will keep talking about this into the next election and beyond. For now, just a few thank yous from me. I promise not to keep you from the drinks for too much longer, but there are drinks, and please join us because we'd love to continue the conversation. Huge thanks to Airbnb, to all of our panelists, and to our wonderful London Playbook team for conducting such interesting interviews and panels. And thank you all so much for joining us. Hope to see you in the bar. Thank you very much.